Imagine a man so powerful, he didn't just rule a country, he owned one, not metaphorically, literally. This is the story of King Leopold II, and how he turned the Congo Free State into one of the deadliest forced labor systems in history. A story of greed, silence, and millions who never got justice. In the late 1800s, Africa became the center of European ambition. Powerful nations gathered, each eager to claim a piece of the continent. Leopold, however, had a different approach. He didn't come with armies at first. He came with words, with promises, with carefully constructed lies. He funded expeditions into Central Africa, presenting them as scientific and humanitarian missions. He spoke about ending the slave trade, about building schools, about helping local communities. To the outside world it sounded noble, even admirable, but what he was really building was control. Step by step, agreement by agreement, he positioned himself not just as a participant in Africa, but as its secret owner. At the infamous Berlin Conference, European powers sat around a table and did something extraordinary and horrifying. They divided an entire continent. Lines were drawn across maps with no regard for the people who lived there. Kingdoms were split, cultures were ignored, lives were reduced to borders on paper. And in that room, Leopold made his boldest move. He convinced the world that he alone should control a vast region in Central Africa, not as a king of Belgium, but as a private individual. And shockingly, they agreed. What emerged was something the world had never seen before, the Congo Free State. It was not a colony of Belgium. It was not governed by a nation. It belonged entirely to one man. Leopold now ruled over millions of people from thousands of miles away, without accountability, without oversight, and without mercy. At first, the people of the Congo did not fully understand what had changed. There were new faces, new rules, new demands. And then those demands became impossible. The world was changing, industry was booming, and one resource suddenly became incredibly valuable. Rubber. Rubber for tires, for machines, for the modern world that Europe was rapidly building, and the Congo was rich with it. Leopold saw this not as a blessing, but as a goldmine to be drained. Villages were given strict quotas. Men were forced deep into forests to extract rubber from trees. Day after day, week after week, the work was exhausting, the conditions brutal, and the quotas, they were often impossible to meet. But failure was not an option. To enforce his rule, Leopold created a force known as the Force Publique, an army designed not to protect, but to control. These soldiers were armed, trained, and given one clear objective: extract as much rubber as possible, by any means necessary. Villages that failed to meet quotas were punished, homes were burned, families were taken hostage, men were beaten. Fear became the language of the land. Every path into the forest, every knock on the door, every approaching footstep carried terror with it, because, under Leopold's rule, mercy did not exist. And then came one of the most chilling practices in human history. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet they used, to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition. They had to present something. A hand, human hands, were cut off and collected as evidence, sometimes from the dead, sometimes from the living. Entire communities were left scarred, mutilated, broken. Parents watched their children suffer. Children grew up, surrounded by unimaginable violence. This was no longer exploitation. This was terror turned into policy. For years, this nightmare continued in silence. Back in Europe, Leopold was still seen as a generous ruler. He funded buildings, donated to causes, maintained his image as a humanitarian. And many chose to believe it, because the truth was too uncomfortable, too distant, too easy to ignore. While millions suffered in the Congo, the world looked the other way. But eventually the truth began to surface. Missionaries, travelers, journalists, They saw what was happening. They documented it. They told the stories the victims could not tell themselves. Reports began to circulate, photographs, testimonies, accounts of brutality that shocked those who were willing to listen. The image of Leopold began to crack. As more evidence emerged, public outrage grew. People began to question, to protest, to demand answers. How could one man be allowed to control an entire nation? How could such cruelty continue unchecked? Campaigns were launched, voices were raised. The pressure became impossible to ignore, and for the first time, Leopold was forced to respond. In 1908, under intense global pressure, Leopold was forced to give up control of the Congo. It was no longer his personal empire, but the damage had already been done. Millions had died, countless lives had been shattered, and the land itself carried the weight of what had happened. Today, the story of the Congo under Leopold remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, not just because of the scale of suffering, but because of how long it was allowed to continue. It is a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked, when greed outweighs humanity, when the world chooses silence over truth. And even now, the echoes of that past can still be felt in the land, in the people, in history itself.